Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Old South Meeting House. My name is Erica Lindemood. I'm the Education Director here at the Meeting House. I'm pleased to welcome you this evening to the first lecture in a three-part series whose title is Exploring the Stamp Act, Hangings in Effigy, Crowd Actions, and Funerals for Liberty. Liberty, in quotes. And now I'm pleased to welcome Paul Revere House's Research Director, Patrick Leahy, who will say a few words about the series and about this evening's speaker.
Our speaker here tonight is Benjamin Carp, who's Daniel M. Lyons Professor of American History, Brooklyn College, City University of New York. Ben received his bachelor's degree from Yale University and then his master's and PhD from the University of Virginia. He served as assistant and associate professor of history at Tufts University before he moved to New York to Brooklyn College. And he also, for a while, was lecturer in history at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland.
And thanks to all the organizations that helped to bring this together, I'm very pleased to be back at the Old South Meeting House. As primarily a Tea Party guy, I feel like this is home. But today, we're going to make some gestures towards the Boston Tea Party, but mostly, we're going to be talking about the event that we've just commemorated the 250th anniversary of, which is the political action against the Stamp Act in Boston. And so my talk today is called Troubling Their Neighbors, Boston Mobilizes Against the Stamp Act. And also because the Paul Revere House is one of the sponsors of this, I want to make sure that Paul Revere is part of this story as well, in part because the image that we see here was basically right across the square from Paul Revere's house. Paul Revere's house made it, Hutchinson's did not. And let's talk about that house that we see behind me. "The hellish crew fell upon my house," said Lieutenant Governor and Chief Justice Thomas Hutchinson, "with the rage of devils, and in a moment with axes split down the door and entered." You can see why a Tea Party guy like me might be interested in this, because axes, splintering open wood things, that's what the Tea Party is all about. "Damn him, he is upstairs," the crowd cried. "We'll have him." And the Boston crowd rushed into this elegant townhouse. They tore off the wainscoting and wall hangings. They split the doors to pieces. They tore down the cupola. They swarmed over the roof and tore the slate and boards from it. They flattened the fence and the trees. They drank his booze, and they destroyed or carried off his silver plate, family portraits, household furniture, clothing, and cash. They scattered his public and private papers, including, and this is the part that really hurts historians, including manuscript materials for the next volume of his History of Massachusetts that he had spent 30 years accumulating, and possibly, some people suspected, some papers related to a Maine land grant that was under dispute. So all sorts of stuff getting destroyed. And this was the second, and some say more violent, of the two major Stamp Act riots in Boston, and this event took place on August 26th. 1765. Now, for decades, historians have pondered a number of questions related to this incident. How had such a thing come to pass? Was the cause socioeconomic unrest, right, comparing it to the French Revolution perhaps, or was it mainly inspired by British imperial politics or local politics, things having to do with specifically Massachusetts or Boston issues? Was it the work of a tiny faction of Bostonians, or did it express the feelings of the majority? Was it the true prologue of the American Revolution, or does it just look like that in retrospect, in hindsight? We may not be able to reach definitive answers to all of these questions today, but I do want to discuss the one question that has most interested me in looking at this incident, which is, given that Bostonians had such different interests and ideas from one another, and given the intensity of the political controversy over the Stamp Act and other issues, how were Bostonians able to unite against the British Parliament? And was this an alliance built to last? So, let's go into some background. In the aftermath of the French and Indian War, Great Britain and its American colonies were riding high. People in the British American colonies, white people in the British American colonies were the most gently governed, lightly taxed, least oppressed people in the Western world in 1763. So how do we go from that to destroying poor Thomas Hutchinson's house? As for Great Britain, it had just won a world war, defeated the French and basically kicked them off the continent. They were the masters of the eastern seaboard of North America. They were the master of the high seas. But as any fan of Spider-Man can tell you, with great power comes great responsibility. So now they have this increased empire, but they have to be able to control it, to manage it, defend it, and pay for it. And that might mean, for some of their colonies, a little more government and a little more taxation. Now, George III here, who had ascended to the throne in 1760, and his prime minister, George Grenville, they commit themselves to austerity, a familiar word to us today, and reform. And one of their emphases is going to be forcing the colonies to bear some of the costs of the war. Not, in my opinion, an unreasonable request. People had been trying to reform the empire, make it a little bit more efficient for decades, but now the debt crisis is going to give it new urgency. At the start of the French and Indian War, the British national debt had been 74.6 million pounds. Now it's 122.6 million pounds with an annual interest of 4.4 million pounds and still growing. So George Grenville and Lord Bute, who is another advisor to the king, dismantle the army and the navy as a whole, but they also double the size of the garrison in North America to a standing force of 7,500 regulars, mostly stationed out on the frontier in an arc that stretched all the way from Louisburg up in what's now Canada to Fort Loudoun in present-day Tennessee. Which is the same distance from Paris to Moscow. So that's a lot of area to patrol. And they expect that the Americans are going to, help pay for this garrison because soldiers are expensive to keep up. So they start to look around for more revenue streams. Where can we get a little revenue to pay for this? And they say, well, all right, duties on goods shipped to America. Why not that? We've got a customs service in place. How are they doing? And they look at the books and they find rampant smuggling and corruption in America. The customs service is raising a measly £2,000 per year, but it's costing £8,000 to maintain. Yikes! They find the customs officials were often absentee. Some of the ones that were stationed in American ports were lazy and easily bribed. And so a little bit of reform is going to be needed. So they begin to pass a series of acts beginning in 1764. So one, the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act actually was going to lower the duty on molasses in order to discourage smuggling, right? Discourage people from getting their molasses from the French. Get it from British islands instead. That is going to increase British revenue. And they're going to reform the customs service in other ways as well. Now, ships had to fill out elaborate paperwork in order to prove compliance with the law. Now, judges in vice admiralty courts, which didn't have juries, right? The juries were often friendly to merchants, but in a vice admiralty court, you don't have to worry about these pesky juries. Now these vice admiralty courts could rule on cases and order the seizure of ships. Any customs officer, informer, or naval officer who was involved in the seizure of an American ship received a share of the profits from the sale of that ship at auction. If an American merchant was wrongly prosecuted, he had no power to sue the British official for damages. And the Royal Navy was now going to have a new role. It was already unpopular for the practice of impressment, which I'll be talking about a bit more. Impressment was forcibly recruiting men for the Royal Navy, which meant harsher condition and worse pay. But now the Royal Navy is going to have a new power, which is that they also are going to be able to have, as they did during the war, have the power to seize and otherwise harass American merchant ships. At this point in 1764, they also announced the intention of levying a stamp duty of some kind, so Americans and friends of Americans begin thinking and worrying about this. In 1764, Parliament also passes the Currency Act, which is going to restrict the colony's ability to issue paper money. That matters for various reasons, makes it harder to do certain kinds of business in the colonies. And it's bad timing for the American colonies, especially in Boston. Boston had a really bad fire in 1760, terrible storms. It was in the midst of a post-war recession. There were bankruptcies, a smallpox outbreak, new local taxes, political infighting. And all of this results in unemployment, poverty, crime, and street violence, which all seemed to be peaking in the early 1760s. In Boston, the North End and the Dockside areas seem to have been hit the hardest, and many of the local royal officials and other government supporters had bought fancy houses out in the suburbs, which seemed to indicate to people that they were ignoring the plight of the poor city folk. So there's tension in Boston, and these imperial laws come crashing down on this tension, and it becomes this boiling soup that's ready to boil over. So, and then after this kind of double whammy comes the Stamp Act itself. What was the Stamp Act? Well, it forces you to buy stamps for certain kind of documents and pay a fee for those stamps. So what it effectively means is it's going to be a tax on attorneys' licenses and other court documents, ship clearances, college degrees, land deeds and land grants, mortgages and leases, contracts, bonds, articles of apprenticeship, and articles of appointment to public office, liquor licenses, playing cards and dice, pamphlets, newspapers, advertisements, and almanacs. So all of those kinds of documents now had to have a stamp of some kind. The Treasury Office would distribute the stamped paper necessary for these items through an appointee in each colony, and these laws were particularly, your average farmer might not ever have to deal with one of these papers, or might only have to deal with these kinds of papers once or twice in their lives. But the laws particularly affected certain kinds of city dwellers, right? Merchants, brokers, mariners, distillers, lawyers, tavern patrons, newspaper printers, and local officials, which from a political standpoint are exactly the kind of people you don't want to get angry, because they're exactly the kind of people who are going to be politically connected, talking to one another, have the most ability to get their message out among the people. And so this ends up being a real political disaster for Great Britain. One of the things that historians often emphasize about the imperial conflict and the resistance and the American resistance is just how much the distance of communication, right? 6 to 8 weeks to get a ship across the Atlantic, how much that lack of understanding between Britain and its American colonies ended up being really telling in the imperial crisis. So let me introduce you to the Boston Waterfront of Paul Revere's day. The Boston Waterfront was a place where men and women, rich, middling, and poor, interacted and negotiated in a day-to-day, face-to-face way. Anyone know the population of revolutionary Boston? I know you do. 16,000 people, right? Really small number of people, and most of them are women and children. So we always talk about, these famous men, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, but really that's not what characterizes Boston at this time. It's got a small town feel. Yes, there were immigrants and travelers, so new faces in that way, runaways and epidemic diseases. It was a place of authority, and it was a place of new ideas, culture, news, and goods. All of these things are coming and going, linking the people of Boston to the Atlantic world and the wider British Empire. But and as a result, you can see how the Boston and its waterfront would become a place of conflict, a place where seafarers, shipbuilders, and merchants would come into conflict with customs officials, British troops when they arrive, and naval officers. And a little digging in the archives reveals a long history of riots, burning boats, smuggling, non-importation agreements, tar and featherings, all of which culminate, in my opinion, in the dumping of tea chests into the harbor, right? So this is one way that we can look at resistance in Boston, is as a series of waterfront events. The boundaries of waterfront space were difficult for Bostonians to determine, but the waterfront felt distinct nonetheless, and Bostonians on the waterfront were part of a self-conscious community. A significant number of Boston's caulkers or ship joiners, for instance, lived on the same block. A variety of men and women from various trades, shipbuilding and commerce, but also shoemaking, silversmithing, prostitution, and tavern keeping. These often lived, worked, and interacted as part of a waterfront community. An orphan, and there was a fluidity to this community as well. An orphan might become an apprentice in a maritime craft. A seaman might become a quartermaster or might retire to become a dock worker or an artisan. A captain or a shipwright might become a wealthy merchant in his own right. And so the waterfront, by definition, was not a place of kind of rigid and formal boundaries. And since no place in Boston was more than a half mile from the waterfront was also not a bounded space. Instead, it was an integral, dominant part of Boston's larger urban setting and a space with a complex sub-community of its own. And this self-consciousness was politicizing, because the space that led this community to aggregate also led them to define who they were going to exclude from waterfront space. And this, during the imperial crisis, primarily became the British officials who made their presence in Boston obnoxious through impressment of people for the Royal Navy, through seizing ships for customs violations, and through military occupation, the event depicted in Paul Revere's engraving here in 1768. Initially, and then again in 1774. Initially, British officials were members of the waterfront community alongside the oystermen and the ship joiners, right? The three branches of the imperial government that had a distinct presence on the waterfront were the Vice Admiralty Court, the Customs House, and the Royal Navy. And these made up an uncomfortable but relatively tranquil imperial system in Boston prior to 1763. But after 1763, these officials come to be perceived as outsiders when they attempt to control Boston's waterfront at the behest of their British superiors. Waterfront dwellers reacted by mobilizing as a more cohesive, politicized community and asserting their own control over this contested space, often banishing offenders from their midst. These protests against imperial authority were a way for Bostonians to engage the British authorities self-consciously in a bitter contest for control over the waterfront. And I love that this moment is captured here, of the British ships surrounding Long Wharf and the British troops being rowed to the tip of Long Wharf. An amazing moment. So I get to use my pointer here, right? One of the things that I really want to talk about is Castle Island, which is right here. So here's one obvious manifestation of this community in action. Exiling obnoxious officials to Castle Island, what's now Fort Independence. It's connected to the mainland, but it wasn't then. And this happened at least 5 times between 1747, so before the imperial crisis got started, and 1774. Right, so the Massachusetts governor, William Shirley, fled to Castle Island during the Knowles Riot of 1747. What happened during the Knowles Riot? Commodore Charles Knowles had picked up 46 men with the press gang, including some local Bostonians, and the Boston crowd had responded by taking some Navy officers prisoner, holding them hostage, breaking windows, harassing authority figures, and burning a boat on Boston Common, and then patrolling the wharves to prevent any Navy officers from escaping. So that was one time when the governor was like, I'm checking out, I'm going to go hide out in the fort for a little while. Then again in 1765, during the Stamp Act crisis, Governor Francis Bernard fled there after the riots of August 14th, which I'll discuss shortly. And from there, he could see the bonfires that the crowd had lit on Fort Hill in defiance of British authority. In 1768, the customs officers were forced to flee to Castle William for months after being attacked during the Liberty Riot, which had led to the stationing of British troops in town in the image we just saw previously. And then in March 1770, these troops would then have to flee to Castle Island in the aftermath of the Boston Massacre. And then again in 1773, the tea consignees and the customs commissioners would flee there in the weeks before the Boston Tea Party. So in all 5 of these instances, there's actually a pattern, right? Bostonians enforced the banishment of offensive British officials because they had begun to perceive the land of liberty as a space free from unconstitutional authority. Each time, British officials were attempting to use either customs laws or the threat of violence to extend its authority. Members of the waterfront community would respond in minor ways at first, perhaps even in lawful ways, but the scuffle for control would culminate in some kind of major violent crowd action. And this blatant display of animosity would compel British officials to flee to Castle Island and step up their plaintive requests back home for assistance from England. The British Imperial Command and the elite Sons of Liberty would respond in the ways that they thought most appropriate, leading to some kind of tentative settlement of the contest for control over the port and the waterfront. But in the decade before independence, the repercussions would become increasingly far-reaching, and each time the stakes for waterfront control in Boston became higher. And the Stamp Act crisis, I want to argue, was a crucial step in this progression of events and the struggle for control that characterized Boston during the imperial crisis. Each of these events also signified the ways that the harbor had become a political border zone of sorts, separating Castle Island from the Boston Peninsula and keeping unlawful British authority at a safe distance. Bostonians singled out the waterfront as a part of the city that suffered particularly from British policies. Boston's maritime commerce was always vulnerable to market swings throughout the Atlantic world, competition from other ports, and other circumstances beyond the inhabitants' control. And so they particularly feared the Navy and the Commissioners of Customs because of their power to aggravate or instigate trade difficulties. Merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, laborers, and their neighbors recognized that they were interdependent upon one another economically, and they feared the prospect of a depression that was caused by unconstitutional British policies. Furthermore, having come face to face with the press gang throughout the 18th century, waterfront denizens realized that their liberty might be a precarious thing when British officers wielded power in an arbitrary way. The press gang affected seamen and apprentices most directly, but the rest of the waterfront community rallied around them, asserting a common culture of resistance to tyranny. The events of 1765 to 1775 had threatened the interests of Bostonians all the way from the wealthy and powerful John Hancock down to the lowly impressed seamen. And as a result, a community of interest on the waterfront reflexively defended itself. The ritual acts of banishing customs officers and burning seized boats, for instance, displayed this community's power to patrol its waterfront domain. Press gangs and customs duties made the waterfront a space that was particularly vulnerable to British encroachments upon their liberty. And this was the rationale behind the banishment of British troops and customs officers and governors from their midst. Now, the pattern of crowd action in Boston demonstrated changes over time as well, right? The Knowles, Liberty, and King Street riots, the Boston Massacre, had been spontaneous responses to grievances that affected the local waterfront, right? Impressment, unconstitutional seizure, and military intimidation. The Tea Party, by contrast, was an orchestrated, ideologically motivated response to the final remaining Townshend duty, the duty on tea, and the drawbacks for the East India Company. In addition, it included participants from some of the suburban towns, which indicated wider regional support, although there's some suggestion that people from outlying towns had been involved in the Stamp Act riots as well. This support assured that the Boston harbor and surrounding waterfront would have powerful significance for the colonists. And this matters because in 1774, the main stage is going to switch in some ways from Boston to further inland in Massachusetts. In 1774, John Adams overheard a Shrewsbury farmer say to another, "If Parliament can take away Mr. Hancock's wharf and Mr. Rowe's wharf, they can take away your barn and my house." Right? So the prominent place of the waterfront in Massachusetts life made the physical space of the waterfront an important rallying point, not just for Boston, but perhaps by 1774, the entire province. Farmer, wharf owner, householder, and waterfront resident alike came to see themselves as facing a common danger. And the skeptical Shrewsbury farmer would do well to heed the example of the resistance on the Boston waterfront. This transmission of ideas from city to countryside helped to transform the revolution from a waterfront cause to a countryside cause, and ultimately an intercolonial cause. After 1774, as I said, the story of political mobilization in Massachusetts would not belong just to Boston so much as it would belong also to Worcester and Lexington and Concord and other rural towns, many of which had not been paying much attention to imperial events prior to the Boston Tea Party. Nevertheless, one could argue that the revolution really did begin in the cities because these crowds, drawing their membership from a broad spectrum of socioeconomic groups, these crowds were a particularly urban phenomenon. For this reason, they flourished on the waterfront, which was a site for transitions and for intermingling, a site for commerce and the exchange of ideas, a site for connections to the Atlantic world as well as the rural hinterland. And so in urban spaces like these waterfront zones, urban patriots congregated, politicized, and mobilized in new ways. The Boston waterfront was, in this way, a microcosm of the revolutionary movement, and the rebellion would require the support of an entire community, and so waterfront denizens were expected to show this support time and again. Although class tensions and political disagreements sometimes surfaced in this contested space, the cultural and economic interdependence that was inherent in waterfront space gave its residents grounds for unity in response to a common threat. British officials were defined as outside this unified community, and the colonists grasped the colonists grasped this separation gradually as the distance from Castle Island to Long Wharf, which really wasn't that far, became the analog for the distance from London, the imperial center, to Boston and to America as a whole. While the waterfront community formerly celebrated its British identity, right, they would fire off cannons and wave flags in celebration of the King's birthday and things like that, it was now using its Atlantic and rural connections primarily to promote something new, a burgeoning American identity. So let's see how this works in practice and talk about how these British officials become demonized. In 1764, Rear Admiral Alexander Colville reports, "The captains on the New England station," by which he meant the captains of naval vessels, "are become very unpopular from the nature of their duty as custom house officers, and the odium against them is greatly heightened from the necessity they are frequently under of impressing before they can proceed to sea." So in other words, you need a certain amount of crewmen in order to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. Very often, if you had gaps because people had run away or died or whatever, you would scoop up some guys from the Boston Harbor. You hoped to get escaped sailors from your own Navy, but sometimes a local would have to do. And this really angered people in the Boston community every time it happened. In October of 1764, Boston merchants began boycotting any pilot who escorted the King's ships into the harbor. Because if you're an ocean-going vessel, you don't necessarily know every little rock and shoal in Boston Harbor. You needed a pilot with local knowledge in order to get close enough to the Boston wharves. And so British merchants say, any pilot who works for one of these naval vessels, they can't work for us, which was going to starve these guys. Organization had begun earlier in the 1760s with the formation of a kind of Chamber of Commerce type group, the Society for Encouraging Trade and Commerce within the province of Massachusetts Bay. This was essentially merchants lobbying against the increased regulations and paperwork, against custom house fees, against taxes, and against these increasingly draconian collections methods. In August of 1764, so an entire year before these Stamp Act riots, there was already a movement afoot to encourage the non-consumption of certain British imports, right? This idea that that's how we'll convince the British Parliament to do something about this. We'll try and disrupt British trade as much as we can. Although there were some preliminary debates about the proposed taxation, opposition didn't really begin in earnest until after the news of the Stamp Act arrived in late May 1765. Meanwhile, Thomas Hutchinson finds himself excluded from the waterfront community, even though his family had been part of Massachusetts life, going all the way back to his direct ancestor, Anne Hutchinson. Hutchinson also disliked the Stamp Act and privately urged his superiors in Great Britain to repeal it, but publicly he found himself duty-bound to support it. He didn't like the idea of people beneath him trying to influence his political stance. He starts to become really unpopular. He was already kind of unpopular in 1765, and he becomes deeply unpopular during the summer of 1765. His neighbors remembered that he had opposed paper money back in the 1740, that he had threatened the town meeting in the 1760s, that he had supported the issuance of new writs of assistance in 1761, that he held multiple offices, and that he had this ostentatious wealth, a fancy house in Milton and a fancy house in the North End. And that he had nepotistically appointed his own brother-in-law, Andrew Oliver, as the stamp officer for Massachusetts in 1765. So there was a range of grievances against Hutchinson. And Hutchinson's enemies included not just James Otis and other elite lawyers and legislators like Samuel Adams, who first gets elected to the Massachusetts General Court in 1765, but also a middle-class group of organizers, the Loyal Nine, basically rising small businessmen, distillers, merchants, mariners, one of the printers of the Boston Gazette, which becomes their political mouthpiece, and other master craftsmen. So this is the elite group. And the middling group, how are the more working class group, how are their grievances going to manifest itself? We don't know yet. On July 29th, 1765, the Boston Gazette urges everyone to acquaint themselves with the details of the Stamp Act. Soon in the newspaper, you start to see stories like 22 Marblehead couples getting married all on a single day in order to avoid having their marriage licenses taxed under the Stamp Act. A fire club, this was the first thing I ever wrote, was about fire companies in the Revolution, right? A fire club saying that if the stamp office catches fire, we're not going to help put the fire out. We don't see that as part of our duty. So you start to see these stories about what nonviolent resistance to the Stamp Act might look like. And although the Loyal Nine were more middle class, or maybe upper middle class, one of the things that the Loyal Nine did at some point before mid-August 1765 is they reached out to a poor shoemaker, a guy named Ebenezer McIntosh, who was a trusted crowd leader from the South End. And they also reached out to Henry Swift, a shipwright from the North End. And what these guys were the leader of the North End and South End crowds that would, in a playful but pretty violent way, every November on Pope's Day or Guy Fawkes Day, November 5th, these two crowds would have effigies of the Pope, and they would have contests about which one were superior, and this would often become a kind of violent act, and you would also go around collecting money from wealthy people. It was kind of one of these world turned upside down annual rituals that were kind of frowned upon, but that was the moment for the the moment every year when the working class could shine in its expression of anti-Catholicism and other things. This is what Boston was kind of about. And so, unfortunately, the previous year, a young boy had been killed. So, I mean, these crowd expressions could get out of hand. But what the Loyal Nine does is they reach out to the leaders of these two groups and they say, we want you on our side in order to protest against the Stamp Act. And so this is where the more lower class or working class expression of Boston's resistance to the Stamp Act comes in. On August 14, 1765, the Bostonians prepared effigies of the stamp master, Andrew Oliver, and the devil, sitting inside a jackboot that had a green sole, right, which was a reference to Lord Bute, right? It's a pun on the name, a boot is a pun on the name Bute, and George Grenville, right, the green soul. And so they hung these effigies from an elm tree at the corner of Essex and Orange Streets, which later became known as the Liberty Tree, and they hung a sign promising vengeance against anyone who tampered with the effigies. The sheriff stops by, urging the crowd to disperse, but the crowd threatened him, and so he backed off. And this crowd starts to number over the course of the day in the thousands. Schoolboys waved flags and marched. People shouted liberty and property forever and no stamps. In what the late scholar Alfred Young describes as a Marx Brothers-like ritual, when farmers and teamsters came into town up the Boston Neck, their goods were mock stamped as part of the protest, right? Oh, we're going to stamp your goods. We're going to show you how much British officialdom is about to enter your life. At sunset, the crowd took these effigies to Oliver's dock. They destroyed a building of his that was under construction, where the rumor was that this was going to be the stamp office, and they stamped all of the beams and bricks as they dismantled this building. And then they took the effigies, beheaded them, and then burned them on top of Fort Hill. And this crowd included not just boys and apprentices and sailors, but also, according to observers, elites, right, who were disguised as sailors, but the silk stockings around their ankles were often in evidence. So slumming, I guess, in some ways. This seems to have been a crowd that derived from the whole community. Hutchinson and the sheriff unsuccessfully tried to disperse this crowd later in the day as well, but the crowd threw stones at them and then did further damage to Oliver's house and grounds. They broke some furniture and windows, they stripped his fruit trees, they drank his wine. The merchant Edward Payne wrote that burning Oliver in effigy seemed to be approved of by persons of all ranks, and it was conducted with some prudence. And this was the point where Governor Bernard flees to Castle William, saying he didn't want to suffer the indignity of witnessing these insults to His Majesty's government, but we have to imagine that he was also afraid that the crowd might come to him as well. Now, according to the way it was spun later, it's August 26th, a few days later, when things get really ugly, because Thomas Hutchinson had kind of hid from the crowd in his house and refused to speak to them, and then he goes out of town for a while. He comes back in time for August 26th, and now there's going to be a real confrontation. At dusk, a bunch of boys started a bonfire in King Street, what's now State Street. A fire warden tried to step in, but somebody whispered to him that he shouldn't interfere, and when he ignored those whispers, whispers became insults, and insults became assaults. The crowd first threatened Charles Paxton, who was the port surveyor and the marshal of the Vice Admiralty Court. He had already fled his rented house with his family and valuables, and the house's owner was able to persuade the crowd to move on, and he offered them a bowl of punch as compensation, which is often a good way to buy off the crowd. Then the crowd attacked the house of William Story, the deputy register of the Vice Admiralty Court, and Benjamin Hallowell, who is the comptroller of customs. and there's minor damage committed elsewhere. And we've already heard what they did to Hutchinsons House, according to his description. Now, this was later spun by elites as a step too far, and elites attempted to disavow this later action. The town meeting the next day expressed utter detestation of the extraordinary and violent proceedings of a number of persons unknown. Persons unknown. Everybody probably knew who these guys were. It's a town of 16,000. A military watch is appointed, supplemented by fire engine crews and gentlemen volunteers. The Boston Gazette writes, most people seem disposed to discriminate between the assembly of the 14th of the month and their transactions and the unbridled licentiousness of this mob that had destroyed these houses on the 26th. While the cause of liberty requires an extraordinary spirit to support it, the paper said, they would not endorse this kind of robbery and destruction. McIntosh is arrested, but some gentlemen intervene and quickly get him released. Maybe they were afraid he wouldn't take the fall for them. Others were arrested but freed by a crowd, or the grand jury refused to prosecute them. So nothing happens to anyone as a result of this riot. Peter Messer, in an essay, has recently speculated that basically everybody, despite whatever they said in the Boston Gazette and the town meeting, everybody basically thought that this was okay, right? They regretted it later on because Hutchinson had said, actually, I don't really support the Stamp Act. He had basically done what they wanted Hutchinson to do, and so they kind of retconned the whole thing and said, all right, well, we totally disapprove of this. But Messer speculates that actually there isn't really any inconsistency between the 14th and the 26th, that they're both part and parcel of the same thing, insisting that the imperial authority either obey the waterfront community or they're going to suffer some kind of violence. And so you could say whatever you want in the papers. Part of the audience for those newspapers is either elites in other colonies or officials back in Britain, right? Like, oh, we're a peaceful town. We can't countenance any of the violence that happened, right? It's exactly the same thing that John Adams has to do when he's defending the soldiers that had fired on the crowd during the Boston Massacre. Oh, it wasn't us. This wasn't countenanced by the good people of the town. It must have been black people and Irish people and boys and sailors, right? The people we don't like in town. So this was the game that Bostonians would often play. They would very robustly argue against whatever British officials were doing. Then a violent crowd action would happen, and I think in their heart of hearts they were like, good, the authorities need to be shown what happens to you if you defy us. But outwardly they would say, oh no, we don't approve of this kind of thing at all. Meanwhile, of course, the Sons of Liberty, right? An intercolonial movement had formed with merchants urging one another to stop importing goods. The Stamp Act Congress meeting in New York in September and October, closing courthouses, etc. Governor Francis Bernard makes a statement about these boycotts. He says, if trade and navigation shall cease by shutting up these ports because you're boycotting the stamps on port clearances, can you depend on recovering your trade again? How do you know that Salem and Gloucester won't run away with all of your business? Can the people of this province subsist without navigation for any long time? What will become of the seamen who will be put out of employment? What will become of the tradesmen who will immediately depend upon navigation for their daily bread? Will these people endure want? In other words, endure poverty quietly without troubling their neighbors? What will become of the numberless families which depend upon the fishery, right? Bernard is trying to argue exactly what I'm saying, that the waterfront is interdependent. Merchants, craftsmen, fishermen, seamen, they've all got to stand together. But his audience, in this case, were the gentlemen of the House and the Council, and he hoped that they at least would recoil at the prospect of hungry crowds troubling their neighbors as they had during the previous month's riots. How does the House respond? How does the General Court respond? They confidently answer him that there would be no danger of outlawry. Instead, they boldly declared, when our sacred rights are infringed, we feel the grievance. The newspapers hastened to assure the public that all efforts would be made to keep ordinary seamen, this valuable set of people, employed, and that mussels, clams, and cod were sufficiently available to feed anyone who was impoverished by the stoppage of trade. Some historians have asked, which is it? Is everyone united against the Stamp Act, or is the destruction of Hutchinson's house and the elite condemnation of it indication of some kind of burgeoning class conflict? Was Samuel Adams behind the scenes as a puppeteer pulling the strings, using McIntosh as his puppet? I don't think any of these things are true. I think that while the poor, middle class, and elite all pursued their own interests in the way that they best saw fit, they each saw a virtue in making common cause against the Stamp Act. And I think that politicians like Samuel Adams played a double game. On the one hand, they knew that they could gesture towards crowd action as a threat against government supporters, but on the other hand, they also knew that they had to condemn these crowd actions publicly so that they could continue to try and get support in Britain in order to change the laws, because of course they're not represented in Parliament themselves. And this is how the Waterfront Alliance worked. Not everyone in the coalition agreed, and no one was taking orders from everyone else, but they could see Parliament and its subordinates as the but if they could see Parliament and its subordinates as the enemy, then they could all unite and act in concert. And so we can see how this works later on. On November 1st, so this is a later image, but it's meant to evoke what a funeral procession might look like. On November 1st, 1765, the day the Stamp Act was supposed to go into effect, order seemed to have been restored and the town's unity was on full display. At dawn, a conch shell sounded and bells tolled. Flags flew at half-mast. Shops were closed up. A funeral procession escorted effigies of George Grenville and John Husk, another member of Parliament, to the gallows where they were torn to shreds. The Stamp Act was not going to be enforced in Boston, and the militia wouldn't even agree to act as peacekeepers in order to prevent a riot from breaking out. Then November 5th was Pope's Day, a day that traditionally had been a day of North End versus South End conflict. But instead of the usual brawl, the leaders, McIntosh and Swift, marched hand in hand and then sat down for a Union feast at the Royal Exchange Taverns. Although one of the sources mentions that no African Americans were allowed to show up at this feast, which may have been a kind of foreshadowing of the role they were expected to play in the new nation. But that's maybe a separate story, although some people see it as central to the story. Then on December 17th, 1765, on the previous day, the Sons of Liberty had demanded that Andrew Oliver appear again before the Liberty Tree and resign again because he'd finally gotten the official paperwork for his appointment. And so Oliver goes out in the pouring rain and publicly resigns again. Some elite Sons of Liberty celebrated with a genteel supper, and they chuckled that McIntosh had been the public face of this entire thing. So I want to start to conclude by talking about two summaries of 1765. And one of them is an engraving by Revere that was advertised on January 27, 1766, a view of the year 1765, showing Boston and the colonies protecting Lady Liberty against a dragon while John Husk dangles from the Liberty Tree. John Adams gives another history of the year 1765 on December 18th. The year 1765 has been the most remarkable year of my life. And he'd see a lot of remarkable years later on. That enormous engine, fabricated by the British Parliament for battering down all the rights and liberties of America, I mean the Stamp Act, has raised and spread through the whole continent a spirit that will be recorded to our honor with all future generations. In every colony from Georgia to New Hampshire inclusively, the stamp distributors and inspectors have been compelled by the unconquerable rage of the people to renounce their offices. Such and so universal has been the resentment of the people that every man who has dared to speak in favor of the stamps or to soften the detestation in which they are held, how great soever his abilities and virtues have been esteemed before, or whatever his fortune, connections, and influence had been, has been seen to sink into universal contempt and ignominy. And he's basically describing Hutchinson and his allies. The people, even to the lowest ranks, have become more attentive to their liberties, more inquisitive about them, and more determined to defend them than they ever were before known or had occasion to be. Innumerable have been the monuments of wit, humor, sense, learning, spirit, patriotism, and heroism erected in the several colonies and provinces in the course of this year. Our presses have groaned, our pulpits have thundered, our legislatures have resolved, our towns have voted, the crown officers have everywhere trembled, and all their little tools and creatures have been afraid to speak and ashamed to be seen. Finally, on May 17th and 19th, Boston celebrated news that the Stamp Act had in fact been repealed, and Paul Revere draws a picture of an obelisk that was displayed in town as part of the celebration. One final incident that would happen after the Stamp Act crisis shows what a hard time British-appointed officials would have enforcing the law in Boston when the waterfront community was united against them. Daniel Malcolm, a sea captain turned merchant, on September 24th, customs officials accused him of concealing smuggled wine and liquor in his basement, and they issued a search warrant to inspect his house. Malcolm fortifies his house against the inspecting officials, and his neighbors, including Paul Revere and a bunch of boys from the nearby grammar school and journeymen coming home from work, gathered in support. Malcolm holds out until sunset when the warrant expires and the customs officials and sheriff go home. And Malcolm showed his gratitude by passing out free wine. And then he would again get help blatantly smuggling his goods in 1768. And this shows how the waterfront community was able to mobilize a strong coalition against the Stamp Act and might continue to do so against any more encroachments, new taxes, customs regulations, impressment, and whatever else might come their way. Paul Revere is significant because he straddles all of these worlds. He lived on the waterfront, he had connections throughout the artisan and Masonic communities, his engravings were useful as political propaganda for the Sons of Liberty, and like all middle-class patriots, he represented a crucial bridge between elite politicians like Samuel Adams and John Adams and ordinary Bostonians who made up the crowds. He is in this way, I think, the perfect representative for thinking about political actions surrounding the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, because although he was in some ways, as a silversmith, club member, and messenger, quite extraordinary, it's in the more ordinary things about him that make him such a useful window into Boston's history. As we know, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1776, but accompanied it with a Declaratory Act affirming their power to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And so the main questions underlying the Stamp Act crisis were left unresolved. Parliament kicks the can down the road. How would the British government pay for its empire in America, and how much authority did it actually have over its colonies in order to raise that money? These questions, as we know, would eventually lead to a Tea Party and a revolution. But the Stamp Act also raised other questions for Bostonians that hit closer to home. Would they stay in the empire, whether they stayed in the empire or would eventually leave it, would they still be able to get along with one another, and who would have the most authority in the new nation? So thanks everyone for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Dr. Carp. That was quite stimulating. You pointed out at one point that no part of Boston is more than a half mile from the sea. So the big paradigm you've given us tonight is the waterfront community. How is that different from the community of Boston itself?
Like I said, these two are both overlapping, and yet there is something, I think, distinct about the waterfront community. I think that the people who were directly involved in fishing and being on board ships and building ships and trading aboard those ships, that that is a kind of distinct subset. On the other hand, indirectly, everybody is involved in that, because even if you're a baker, very often you might be baking bread for an overseas journey or something like that. So I like to kind of think of it as a kind of subset, but also something that overlaps with the rest of the community. I think it's a way of seeing Boston, but not an exclusive way of seeing Boston.
Can you talk about the relationship between Boston and the waterfront community seen as a whole and the rest of rural Massachusetts? Because did they see themselves as having very different, distinct interests, or just not caring about Boston's issues?
I think, with the exception of the immediately surrounding towns, I don't think that they see each other as being in common cause yet. Among other things, there was a long history of kind of town versus rural animosity that was often playing itself out in the Massachusetts House of Representatives over the course of the colonial period. But also, that kind of alliance between kind of commercial interests and agricultural interests, or however you want to define it, that takes work, and that work is eventually done, not yet in 1765, but will eventually be done by the Boston Committee of Correspondence, right? Really firing up the engine in 1768 to 1772 to 1773 of sending out circular letters and saying, hey everybody, we really need to get together on this, wake up to these imperial issues which you've been sleepily ignoring because you're only indirectly involved in overseas commerce. You guys need to wake up too. And that's why I love that statement by the Shrewsbury farmer that John Adams is observing in 1774. By 1774, a Worcester County townsman like that can be said to have, to be waking up to this and hearing about this in his own town meeting. And that becomes really important, because once Boston is occupied by British troops, it's not going to be a hotbed of political activism anymore. The main agitation against the British Crown is going to be coming from places like Worcester County or Hampshire County instead. And Ray Raphael, who's spoken here, makes that point pretty well.
You talk about the waterfront community and about them being interdependent, but are there other examples like the one you cite with the Shrewsbury farmer of the lower classes being organized by people from the middle or the higher classes, of Samuel Adams or people like him actually going out and pointing out to people that they are interdependent?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime there's either a town meeting or some kind of club meeting or somebody reading a political piece in a newspaper out loud at a tavern, you can see that kind of what we can call political mobilization at work. Right? We could imagine that the most literate and respected members of communities, whether they were the minister or a wealthy merchant or a wealthy landowner, his ability to articulate the American grievances to his neighbors, if he's the kind of guy who would be elected to town office anyway, or who, if he's a minister, would not be elected to office but would help make out wills and things like that, right? We could imagine that kind of process was taking place increasingly all over America. I just argue that it's in the cities where it tends to happen first, at least in the Northeast where there is a little bit more urbanization.
Well, I think my question is related to that. John Adams, in his statement, spoke of all of the colonies being aroused. And I was curious, were there similar protests in other major cities like Philadelphia or New York or Charleston, and were they based, as in Boston, on the waterfront?
Yeah, so that's one of the arguments in my book, Rebels Rising, is the first chapter focuses on the Boston waterfront, but gestures to the idea that we can see parallel things happening in Newport, Rhode Island, or New York City, or Charleston, South Carolina. Philadelphia is a slightly different story because of the Quaker politics and Benjamin Franklin's role initially in support of the Stamp Act, et cetera, et cetera. So that becomes a little bit more of a complicated story. But yes, I think you can see very distinct parallels. What John Adams says is only from New Hampshire to Georgia, right? People forget that even though it's the 13 colonies that rebel against Great Britain, there are 26 colonies, British colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And, in the Caribbean and in what becomes Canada, you don't see nearly as much of this kind of agitation for reasons of much greater dependence on the British military in some of those places, either the British military or the British Navy. You're not going to see as much of the same level of agitation. Although in the Leeward Islands and places like that, in Jamaica, they don't really care for the Stamp Act there either. But yeah, very often when you see boat burnings and agitation against customs officials and the intimidation of stamp officers, which happens in every single one of the 13 colonies, very often there will be a kind of waterfront cast to that. I don't argue that the waterfront is the only game in town. My other chapters in Rebels Rising are about taverns, which are extremely important, town greens, houses of worship play a kind of interesting role, and even households themselves, right, can all be sites of political agitation. I start with the waterfront, and when I look at Boston, I choose the waterfront as my focus for that story, but there are other places where political mobilization is taking place in the cities.
Yeah, what interested me was you talked about Ebenezer McIntosh having the face of the movement, and that sort of interested me because I'm looking at this from a 21st century perspective, and I'm seeing Paul Revere and John Hancock and Samuel Adams kind of being the star of the show. They get the most press, they get the most ink today, but back in that time I would have seen McIntosh and thought of him more as the star of the show, and would he be the kind of person who would have his own radio show or something? I mean, I'm just saying, it's a little ridiculous, but I'm just giving an example. Would he be the star of the show? Would he be, what kind of prominent, who would he be equivalent to today?
Well, I mean, your radio show example is perfect because it's all about the modes of communication, right? People who are literate and have access to halls of power, right, they're going to be getting their message out in one set of ways. McIntosh's power isn't exuded in a way that's always visible to historians, because historians depend on documents a lot of the time, other things too, but traditionally it's documents. And where McIntosh was best known was in the streets, in street theater, right? And so, he's a kind of on-the-ground kind of figure, and so his influence may well have been deeply felt among his neighbors, but not in ways that are always going to be tangible to historians. And so recovering that process of how a more working-class shoemaker like McIntosh made his leadership felt, right? In ancient Rome, we might have called, he might have been the kind of guy that might have been appointed a tribune of the people, although tribunes, I guess, too, were pretty upper class. But, it's much more difficult for historians to get a sense of that kind of leadership. We're more used to seeing the kind of leadership that we see in a Masonic lodge or in the general court itself, right? That's something that we can read more about, or a newspaper printer, right? We know how those guys make their influence felt, but what historians have concluded is that they can't do it alone, right? They need this broader support, and you're going to need to have some kind of connections with this working class community if that working class community sees itself as having its own distinct interests, which Alfred Young, who's written a kind of mini biography of McIntosh, argues was the case. So who would he be equivalent to today? He would be equivalent to maybe somebody in the Black Lives Matter movement, agitating in the streets of Ferguson or something like that. Somebody who was a known and respected community member, but not necessarily somebody coming from, from the legislature, or even a church leader might be kind of too elite for that kind of person. You'd have to think through that analogy in order to try and find somebody who would be the equivalent today.
In your view, what kind of impact did this mobilization have in England? Did it play a part in Parliament rescinding the stamp tax? Did it play a part in Parliament also putting forward the Declaratory Act, or was it overlooked?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, Parliament ends up in an identity crisis every time something like this happens, because there are going to be hardliners who are like, they can't defy our authority, let's come down on them like a ton of bricks. And others who are like, if you let this go too far, it's going to disrupt trade. Why don't we find a way to pacify this kind of situation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why you see Parliament doing both things at once. They repeal the Stamp Act, they make the concession, and yet they reinforce their authority through the Declaratory Act. And one of the most famous incidents of what happens as a result of the Stamp Act is Benjamin Franklin being interviewed in Parliament, where he is expected to stand in for American grievances and say, will they tolerate other kind of taxes? Tell us something about this. So Benjamin Franklin, who actually plays a kind of complicated role because he was initially a kind of a supporter of the Stamp Act and he didn't realize how unpopular it was going to be. Then Benjamin Franklin, along with Parliament, sees the reaction in America, and so then Franklin, who comes to be the representative, who comes to be the lobbyist for the Massachusetts House of Representatives in Parliament, right? He ends up having to be the mouthpiece for Americans, even as what he really believes in is if Britain and the American colonies could figure out a way to get along, there could be a great Anglo-American empire, and he's doing his best to hold that together as late as 1774. But yeah, no, absolutely, Parliament is reacting to what's going on. And one of the things that Massachusetts people will later say is, we aren't being realistically portrayed by British officials in Parliament. They keep casting us in the worst possible light. That's why you keep punishing us with these terrible taxes. If only we could explain ourselves to you and not have to worry about these fiends like Hutchinson, we'd be able to truly express what's going on in the American colonies and how much we're hurting. Can we get a little bit more of a direct line to you? But what the American colonies eventually find is they're never as well connected in Parliament as, say, the West Indian Islands and even the East India Company, which had much, where their financial interests are much better represented in Parliament. The American colonies are trying to scrape by with these lobbyists. Franklin ends up representing 5 colonies all on his own, and Franklin's doing his best, publishing propaganda pieces, working the system, trying to, fighting with Hillsborough, blah blah blah. But he's just, Massachusetts thinks it's all a matter of miscommunication, and if only they could, make their case more properly to Parliament, that Parliament would start to treat them a little better. And eventually, the American colonies say, we're banging our heads against the wall. It's not just Parliament and corrupt ministers that are against us. It seems like the king's against us as well. But they really don't come to that conclusion until, or the colonies as a whole really don't come to that conclusion until 1776. But it happens very rapidly after 1774. They realize that the coercive acts are the canary in the coal mine, and that it might really be time to leave.
Thank you very much, Ben, for a really interesting presentation.
In the past, New Englanders had actually allied with the Mohawks on occasion, for instance, during King Philip's War.